Welcome to the May meeting of the Citizens Water Advocacy Group, affectionately known as CWAG. We're here today to talk about the Upper Verde River, and the Big Chino Aquifer. This is the meat and potatoes part here. We're in for a big treat. Dr. Ed Wolf of our Education Committee, we heard from earlier, is going to make a presentation about the Big Chino Aquifer and the Verde River. Edward Wolf, PhD, is a retired geologist who spent his career with the U.S. Geological Survey. Over nearly 40 years, he worked with the USGS in Western Kentucky, Northern California, Northern Arizona, Hawaii, the Pacific Northwest, the Philippines, and the Moon from a distance during the Apollo program. Much of the work was related to areas of young volcanic rocks into active volcanoes, especially Kilauea, Pinatubo, and Mount St. Helens. You got around, man. When he retired to the Prescott area, he recognized that his geologic experience in northern Arizona could have application in interpreting and explaining the area's severe water resource issues. Over the past decade, both singly and with retired USGS groundwater hydrologist William Meyer, he has written numerous articles and has given many presentations on groundwater issues, particularly with respect to the Upper Verde River watershed and the Verde River. Wolf was a founding member of the Citizens Water Advocacy Group's Board of Directors, the former chairman of the Verde Watershed Association, former chairman of the Verde River Basin Partnerships Technical Advisory Group, and I understand there's some people here today from the Verde Valley who are maybe, I see some people raising their hands back there. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. And then the former chairman of the Partnerships Board of Directors. Help me welcome Dr. Edward Wolf.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll just go back to the opening slide here. So the title here is the Big Chino Groundwater, Essential Source of Upper Verde River Stream Flow. And we're going to develop that, and the intention here is to sort of start at an easy, at an introductory level and try to help you understand what this issue is about. We're going to take questions. We're not going to take questions if there is a sort of a one-sentence issue of clarification where you need to get something clarified so you know what I'm talking about. Just stand up and ask the question. I'll repeat the question so that it can be captured in the video that we're making. After the talk, we'll ask people with real questions to come up to this microphone to ask them. But we're not going to have discussions during the talk. That we're really trying to work so we end up with coherent videos. So, got a little pointer here. This is a new one for me to have this pointer. So I called this a day at the beach. And is there anybody here who hasn't been near a river or a lake or the ocean and dug a hole in the sand and found water in the hole? Everybody's got the idea on that. That water that you found in the hole is groundwater. And the level of the water in the hole is the level of the water table at that spot. When you drill a well, the water rises to a level in the well, and that level is the level of the water table. And we'll talk a little more about the water table as we go. So the area down here, right at a lower level in the hole than the surface of this standing water, is an aquifer. And we'll get into what that means pretty soon. Okay, so I wondered what to call this. This is a southwestern sort of mountain basin with a mountain block on each side and a valley in between them that's filled with stream deposits. We call that alluvium. So it's an alluvial valley. And the Little Chino subbasin, where we are right now, is that kind of alluvial valley between two mountain blocks. The Black Hills on one side and Williamson Valley Mountain and other, I'm sorry, Granite Mountain, thank you. I used to live essentially at the base of Granite Mountain, but I get to the point where sometimes, what's that called? And maybe some of you know about that. So anyway, this area between the mountains on the west and the mountains on the east is an alluvial basin, just like this one, which is filled with sand and gravel and various kinds of water-laid deposits. So an aquifer, and we have an aquifer in here, the area below the water table. An aquifer is a body of water-saturated rock or sediment that is sufficiently permeable. And permeable means it's got lots of spaces. If it's sand and gravel, it's got spaces between the grains. And permeability is a measure of the ability of the water to flow through the aquifer. It flows through the spaces between the grains of sand and silt and gravel. So it's sufficiently permeable to store or transmit groundwater to wells, springs, or streams. So water falls, it runs down, I'm sorry, I have to learn to, I'm not standing here with a pointer. It runs down the mountain front here onto this basin that's filled with debris eroded from the adjacent mountains. And these blue arrows represent recharge. And a major area for recharge, that is water percolating, soaking into the ground and percolating and flowing down to the aquifer. A major zone for recharge would be washes. In this case, a dry wash, which has water running in it when there's a storm or snow melt, and water percolates downward from there to the water table. We call that process recharge. It's how the water gets back into the aquifer. If we could manage to never consume more groundwater than is recharged, we wouldn't have much of an issue. We'd still have something of an issue, but not the kind of issue that we're facing here, where our use of groundwater in the Prescott Active Management Area is approximately double all of the recharge to the aquifer. And that is a long-term problem. So a little more on aquifers. Here's a close-up. So the water table is the surface of the saturated, what we call the saturated zone. And this boundary right here is the water table. The spaces between the grains or whatever voids there are in the rock below the water table are completely filled with water. Above, so you can look at these diagrams, here's some solid rock. This would be like the granite that we see in the granite dells, another place here. At shallow levels, near the surface, that granite is fractured, and it can serve as an aquifer if those fractures are connected and have water. It usually doesn't make a very good aquifer, and some of the wells that are pretty iffy are iffy because they're drilled into granite where the water exists only in cracks, and it's not as good as an aquifer composed of gravel. There are also, so we have above the water table, we have what we call the unsaturated zone, and below the saturated zone, and that's where the groundwater is. So all kinds of cracks. Some of the biggest kinds of openings that you might have would be in limestones, where you actually have pipes that are a consequence of erosion. If you go to a place like Karchner Caverns, you've got huge pipes that are a consequence of erosion, and where the rock is buried, they could be full of water. But most of the time, we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with deposits of sand and gravel and silt and sometimes clay, which barely transmits water at all. So it's important to think about the difference in terms of flow rate, I don't know, I haven't heard this lately, but when I first got here and started going to meetings of the Water Advisory Committee, which was a county organization, there were people who talked about underground lakes. And in fact, there was one Prescott City councilman who was on the Water Advisory Committee that said, don't worry, we find a new source every 40 years. And I think what he had in mind that there's an underground lake and you just have to find the next underground lake and then you're good to go. Well, it doesn't really work that way. All we've got is these deposits with spaces, most of which are very tiny, and they have to be connected for it to be an aquifer. So it's important to consider the flow rate. A stream flows at a rate of miles per day, at a high rate, cubic feet per second in streams. Aquifers normally, with the exception of some limestones with big cave systems in them, aquifers aren't like that, and we're looking at flow rates that might be a few feet per day or a few feet per year. But you have to remember that this flow is taking place over a vast area, whereas a stream is very confined, and so you can have a lot of water moving very slowly down the aquifer toward the stream, but it is very slow. Okay, so let's look at the effect of wells on groundwater and on streams. So the blue area in here represents an aquifer, so it might be a body of sand and gravel and so on. So the brown part is the unsaturated zone. This is the saturated zone. This is the water table. There is a stream right there that flows all year round, just like the Verde River. And we've just put a well into this within the last year, let's say. And when you start pumping that, so initially all of the water was flowing from left to right here toward the stream. And on the other side of the stream, it was flowing toward the stream. So the groundwater is moving toward the stream. The groundwater is always moving in a downhill direction. It flows in response to gravity. And when you put in a well, the first thing that happens is you lower the water table right in the area of the well. You reduce pressure in this groundwater system adjacent to the well, and water begins to flow to the well as you pump the well. And if you keep pumping and pumping and pumping, you lower the water table and you start diverting water that had been flowing to the stream toward the well. So the arrows have changed direction here. Whoop, I wanted to do that. So the arrows were going, I'm really trying hard not to point at the screen, and it's hard to do. The water was flowing to the stream here. We started a well, and water began to move away from the stream toward the well. And whoop. And we keep pumping, and the water table gets lower and lower, and we finally get to the point where the stream is completely disconnected from the groundwater. And when it's disconnected, it's likely to be dry, except when there are periods of rainfall or snowmelt. And that's what's happened to almost all of our major rivers in Arizona. The Verde is the most impressive survivor. So we have an example of stream capture right here in our backyard, and that involves Del Rio Springs, which is right here. This is Highway 89. This is in the very north part of the official town of Chino Valley, although it's north of the really developed part of Chino Valley. This is Road 6. This is on Road 6 North. These are springs that were very, very active, vigorous springs in when the first Army people arrived in 1863, the U.S. Army, they came to help protect the miners in the area from marauding natives. And their first camp was at Del Rio Springs, which is now within the boundaries of the town of Chino Valley. It was a wonderful place There was an artesian spring that rose high into the air. There was lots of water. There was lots of game. And they set up camp, which in effect was the first capital of Arizona. After I think less than a year, they moved to Prescott because there were big trees in Prescott that could provide lumber for buildings. But this was the first place. That Del Rio Springs has had a very interesting history involving the railroad and development along the railroad. It was, in effect, the headwaters of the Verde River. The headwaters of the Verde River now is right about here. It's almost 6 miles downstream from where the headwaters was. The best that people have done trying to understand the history of this is that this stretch of the Verde River was perennial up until probably in the 70s. I'm pretty confident it was perennial in the 50s because there was a geologist whom I knew, quite a bit older than I, but whom I knew, who was mapping the geology here, mapping in the 50s, and she described this drainage as perennial, flowing year-round. And Laurie Wirt, who did later work on the groundwater, talked to, I think, everybody she could find and determined that this had stopped flowing perennially in the 70s, costing us about nearly 6 miles of Verde River. So here's a diagram. This is a diagram that shows the rate of flow. So on the left side here, you see the rate of flow in terms of acre-feet per year, and the flow in 1935 was more than 4,000 acre-feet per year. An acre-foot of water is 325,851 gallons. And it's enough water to cover a full-sized professional football field with a little bit more than a foot of water. So that gives you some idea of what an acre. So we had 4,000 acre-feet per year estimated coming out of Del Rio Springs in 1935. It began really decreasing in the 50s, coming down like this. So we went from about 4,000 acre-feet per year to 59 acre-feet per year at the time of this. I didn't put the date on this one, but I'll get you one with a date the next time. The Department of Water Resources estimated that Del Rio Springs will be gone by 2025, and I'll tell you that it is right on track. This is, the USGS installed a stream gauge several hundred yards downstream from Del Rio Springs. When they installed it in 1996, I think it was, the discharge was about 1,200 acre-feet per year. Now we're going to switch a little bit between cubic feet per second and acre-feet per year, and you don't have to do the arithmetic to do that, but the stream gauges measure everything in cubic feet per second, and so I get used to doing both things. 1,232 acre-feet per year is 1.7 cubic feet per second. If you really want to know how to convert them, you use 724.5 as the multiplier or the divider, depending which direction you're going. This record shows the flow from 1996 to through 2017 as declining very regularly at a rate of about 51 acre-feet per year. And in the summer of 2017, the low, which is the summer flow is lower than the winter flow because there's a lot of evapotranspiration done by plants in the summer. And the flow was down to about 181 acre-feet per year. or a quarter of a cubic foot per second. And unless it really levels out, which I don't see much sign of it's doing, it'll be gone well in advance of 2025. So right on schedule. So let's move on now and start talking about the Verde River Basin and so on. This is the Verde River watershed. All of the drainage, all of the surface drainage within this area flows to the Verde River, and it empties to the Salt River right down here at the south end of this thing. Flagstaff is here. This point right here is on the top of Humphreys Peak and on the west side of Humphreys Peak. This end of the basin is up above Seligman, and the Salt River at this end. And then the Verde River is perennial flow, begins right about here, east of Highway, a couple of miles east of Highway 89, at what's referred to as the Upper Verde River Springs. A main reason for pointing to this diagram is that there are 3 stream gauges which are really important with respect to the Verde River. And the only one that we're really going to talk about today is the Paulden stream gauge. That's a stream gauge operated by the USGS. It sends data, I think, data dump every 15 minutes to the USGS. The data are recorded, and you can get, well, Gary came up with instant data. There's high data rate data, or you can get a daily average. And this morning, the daily average for yesterday, for the previous 24 hours, was, just as Gary said, 16 cubic feet per second. So these are the USGS stream gauges, and we're going to talk about the Paulden gauge more than once. So this is Arizona's last best long, perennially flowing stream. All the others have been killed by either groundwater pumping or by diversions, primarily for agriculture, and they don't flow year-round anymore. They're a desert with rain after big storms. But this one flows for 137 miles, virtually uninterrupted to Horseshoe Reservoir, which is a part of the SRP's couple of Verde reservoirs. Pardon? Oh, SRP, Salt River Project. Sorry, these things get to be habit. So the question was, define my acronym. It's Salt River Project. That's just what we needed. Okay. And so the point here was to show, and then the river flows another 51 miles. Again, the water is continuous all the way to the dam close above the junction with the Salt River. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some stream flow data at these gauges. I'm back up again. So Paulden gauge, the Clarkdale gauge, and the Camp Verde gauge. So the USGS put out a report which was published, I think, in 2006, and it was a report on Verde, on the upper and middle Verde River, which is the Verde Valley and the Prescott area and the Big Chino Valley. It was a report on the groundwater and the surface water in this area. There's some pretty interesting numbers on these gauges. They calculated the average base flow. Oh, I need to back up and talk about base flow. Base flow is the component of the water in the river that is supplied by groundwater. If you stopped all the rain and snow, you had no snow melt, which really happens often in the Verde drainage. The water that would be flowing in the river would be the groundwater that was exiting to the river, and we call that base flow. So they determined that from the report came out in 2006. Of course, they had to put the work together earlier than that. So from July 1963 to March 2004, from the data at the Paulden gauge, they determined that the base flow was about 31,000 acre feet per year. The total stream, I beg your pardon, stream flow. And that's equivalent to 42 cubic feet per second. The base flow, the part provided by groundwater, was 17,700 acre feet per year, and that's at 24 cubic feet per second, and that was about 58% of the total flow for the year. The numbers are much bigger for the Clarkdale and Camp Verde gauges because a lot of additional groundwater and additional runoff in streams has come in. Oak Creek, for example, and Sycamore Canyon and Beaver Creek and so on are all added to the stream flow. So this is kind of important, but it's important to recognize that without base flow, the river would only flow when there's runoff from either storms or snowmelt. The rest of the time it would be dry. Okay, I wanted to just talk a little bit about base flow. Here's a diagram of a picture of what you get if you go to the Paulding Gauge website and download the graph. This is a graph for 1 year from, I guess, April or beginning of May through April of the next year. There are two, the stream channel changes in response to flood events. And the USGS gets out to calibrate the data. What that means, they measure the shape of the stream channel, just as the Sierra Club group does, and then they correct the data and recalibrate the flow measurements. So that's why this part is pink. It hadn't been recalibrated at this time, and this part had been recalibrated, and the USGS says this is good data. They call it a period of approved data versus period of approved data. So so the blue line represents the measurement of total stream flow at the gauge for a year. These peaks represent relatively small flow events, up to about 30 cubic feet per second. This is summer. This is the consequence of summer storms. It doesn't have much effect on the long-term flow of the river. And I call the base flow recorded by here, I use 18 cubic feet per second measuring. I go through and I look for 7 days or continuous days or more with the lowest flow and average those numbers, and the lowest flow is contained between these two red lines, the upper line at 18.5 CFS and the lower line, which was the lowest flow in the year of 17.6 CFS. It actually showed that on both sides of these summer storms. So I call that 18 CFS, 18.0, call it 18. Just so you know what I'm talking about. Okay, here's a plot of what I use as a proxy for base flow. The USGS has some complicated algorithm that they use to sum up base flow information. An easy way to get a reasonable proxy for it is to look for the lowest continuous 7 days of flow on the river. And it actually turns out that the values you get from doing that are really close to what the USGS gets, and it's really simple and straightforward. So there's some things you can see here. This is the event that Gary referred to back in 1964, where somebody filling what are called the holiday lakes. I don't know whether there's water in any of them now or not. But there was an effort, I think, to have a big land development, land sale, and they filled these depressions. They probably dug the depressions and filled them. I wasn't there. But they pumped a lot of water, and it caused a huge decline in the base low at the Paulding Gauge, which was almost brand new at that time, and this low of 15 CFS. over the rest of the time, it's largely been between 20 and a little over 25 CFS. And you can see that somewhere in here, here's 1990, here's 2000, somewhere in here, the river starts, the flow at the Paulden Gauge starts a steady decline, and it's, without looking at weather data, which I haven't done, it's difficult to say when the present drought began, but it began somewhere on or before 2000 and continued all the way out here to 2017. And the base flow for a number of years, averaging it, as I explained, has been 18 cubic feet per second for a number of years, except for this year right here, which is 2015, in which the base flow was 17. Now, it's tempting to speculate, and probably one should speculate, that this change going from here out to here is, at least in part, a consequence of climate change. It has really been dry. It's been dry for years. But I wanted to show you what the base flow has done here. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and get talking about our groundwater and our immediate water sources themselves. There are, for Prescott, what we talk, our water source right now is this area. It's the Prescott Active Management Area. Prescott Valley is down here. It pumps down here in this part of the basin, and this part actually down here, kind of all south of Highway 89A, is in the upper Agua drainage watershed. And some part, not all by any means, but some part of Prescott Valley's water is pumped from out of the aquifer that underlies the Agua Fria River watershed. This is the Little Chino subbasin. You could call it the Granite Creek watershed, or the Granite Creek and Little Chino Creek watershed. And all of Prescott's water comes from the Little Chino subbasin. It's all supplied by groundwater. It comes from a number of wells that are actually within the town of Chino Valley, that the city of Prescott got established there before Chino Valley was organized and incorporated. And I don't know how they feel about it, but I wouldn't be happy. This area is the Big Chino Valley, and it's the area that we look to, the city of Prescott looks to play an important role in its future water supply. It's also future because it's also important right now because it provides the vast majority of the flow, as it's been estimated at about 80% or 80 or more percent of the flow to the Upper Verde Springs, which are in this green area right here near the mouth of Granite Creek. And this essentially provides all the flow in the river between here and Perkinsville at mile 24 or 25, however you want to think of it. So these are all light colored because they're filled with alluvial deposits. They're not granitic bedrock with pine trees and so on. They're alluvial deposits, and I think they were largely grasslands when the first sub-modern arrivals came in 1863, and they would still be grasslands, except they've become houselands. This is a geologic map of the same area. Here's the Big Chino Valley. This yellow and tan represents alluvial deposits. The yellow ones represent alluvial deposits from within, at the surface, from within about the last 10,000 years. These are somewhat older, going back some tens of millions of years. So here's the Big Chino Valley. Here's the Prescott Active Management Area, the Little Chino Subbasin. And here's the part of the upper Agua Fria subbasin. And virtually all of our water comes out of these, from groundwater in these alluvial deposits. Here's a diagram that shows them. I didn't want to cut into it here. These colored parts are the young alluvial and volcanic deposits in the Big Chino Valley, in the Little Chino subbasin, and in the Verde Valley. They're between 2,000 and 3,000 feet thick in the Big Chino Valley. In the Little Chino subbasin, their maximum thickness is on the order of 1,000 feet or so, and much of it is much less. The red and orange are between 1 and 1,000 feet, and it's the thickness of the water-saturated part of these basin-fill deposits, which are alluvial deposits and volcanic deposits, volcanic rocks and fragmental volcanic materials. So what you're actually seeing is a diagram showing the depth here. The blue here is something in excess of 2,000 feet, just to give you a sense. So let's hone in on this a little bit more. This is from the 2006 USGS report. And here's the Big Chino Valley, and I'm including Williamson Valley with the Big Chino because the Williamson Valley and the Big Chino Valley are all part of the same aquifer system. These blue lines are not topographic contours. They are water level contours. They're essentially the topography of the water table. And I just want to get that idea here in. So they're like the contour lines that you'd see on topographic maps, except that they're mostly several hundred feet or more below the ground surface, and they are contours on the groundwater surface.
You might mention that's probably altitude from sea level.
That is altitude from sea level, yes. And so this is the same diagram, except I've plastered a bunch of additional arrows just to emphasize how the groundwater flows. The groundwater flows from higher elevation to lower elevation. It flows in response to gravity. It flows at a rate of from a few feet per day to a few feet per year, so it's not quite like a stream. It's flowing from the margins of the basin toward the basin, and then it's in the Big Chino, it's all flowing down the basin toward the Upper Verde River springs, which are about in here. In the Little Chino subbasin, these water level contours aren't so closely spaced. There isn't so much relief on the water surface, but in the Little Chino subbasin, the water is all moving in this direction, and it actually joins the water from the Big Chino Valley, right in this area, and that water altogether goes to the Paulden Gauge. The amount of water estimated coming from the Little Chino, there's no way to put a gauge on that water because it's all groundwater flowing from the Little Chino Valley into the very lower end of the Big Chino system, but it's estimated from groundwater modeling as about 1,500 acre-feet per year, and the current groundwater flows flowing in this direction are measured at the Paulden Gauge, and they're around 13,000, have been around 13,000 acre-feet per year. Today, they're down to about 11,500 acre-feet per year, and we hope they don't go much lower, but are concerned that they will. So all the water is moving down gradient. The gradient is toward the springs, the Upper Verde Springs, and then it exits to the Verde River, and we measure it at the Paulden Gauge. Okay, this is important. I'm going to just read some of this. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. You got to tell me. it's really important that we recognize that in the Verde River and in similar other river systems that the groundwater and the stream flow are a single resource. State law doesn't recognize them as a single resource. They recognize them as different and unrelated, and they operate under different sets of legal rules, which is a part of our problem. That really needs to be changed, because when we pump groundwater, we affect the surface water users downstream, and in some settings, diversion use of groundwater affects flow to the streams. So surface water and groundwater are connected. They're a single resource. There was a hydrologist named C.V. Tice. We've known about this connection for a long time, even though many of us, not necessarily the people in this room, deny it. So he wrote a paper in 1940 in which he wrote this really important connection. All water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere. And in our situation, that loss of water, well, it might be from somebody else's water well, but the one that we're concerned about is the loss of water to the stream flow. In our area, water that is discharged by wells will ultimately result in equal reduction of stream flow. I think that's really well understood, but much of the general public, and I think many of our elected officials, either don't know that concept or refuse to accept it, and it's supported by Arizona's archaic water law. The point is that perennial flow to the entire Verde River is threatened. It's very much threatened by current and potential future pumping in the Big Chino Valley. A component of that threat is pumping it by the communities in the Prescott Active Management Area, which are Prescott and Chino Valley and Prescott Valley and Dewey Humboldt. They also are lowering water levels and adding to the threat to the Verde River. In talking about all this, there is one link in this system that I think really should be the first priority, and that's the Big Chino Valley, and the time to do it is now. So, as you already know, eventual loss of groundwater development, new groundwater development in the Big Chino Valley, combined with groundwater development that's already in place, threatens eventual loss of perennial flow of the Verde River through Perkinsville down to about River Mile 25. There is a slug of additional groundwater that comes into the Verde River below Perkinsville. So we're not threatening drying that from what we do in the Big Chino Valley, but from what we do elsewhere, it would be threatened. And there'd be and if we eliminate flow in the uppermost part of the Verde River by our actions, it's that much less flow in the Verde Valley. Okay, so just some things on the Big Chino aquifer. I just with simple estimates without the advantage of GIS estimated that the area of this, we call it the basin fill aquifer, is approximately 280 square miles. There is national forest land in there, so that the amount of developable land is approximately 225 square miles. I'm assuming that land that's in the national forest won't be developed. That 225 square miles includes private land and state trust land, and I think the state trust land is certainly available for development for someone who will pay the price to buy it. So it's all there. So and county regulations that would control zoning in all this county. This is not in a city, this is all in the county. And the county mandates that we have 2-acre lots. And so this is enough land to provide about 72,000 2-acre lots. There are some lots already developed, but a smaller part, a much smaller part than two. And then I said, well, if it all gets developed, and I'm not talking about next year or even 10 years from now, but over the next century, I think there's a good chance it'll all get developed. It's rolling grassland. It's got to be some of the easiest country to build, put developments on that you could ever find. There's groundwater within a few hundred feet of the surface everywhere in the Big Chino Valley. So if you had 5 homes per acre foot, I think in Prescott the standard now is 3 homes per acre foot. So if you had 5 homes per acre foot, that seems like a moderately optimistic view. The water to provide those homes would come to 14,400 acre feet per year for the total development. That's 20 cubic feet per second. Or it would be about 65,000 gallons per home per year. Most of us could live on that. So it's a reasonable number. I made the assumption that the gallons per person per day, which is a statistic that is commonly used, would provide about 71 gallons per person per day. It doesn't say what that water is used for. I mean, you could use it all for watering roses, but we hope that you won't. In 2017, Paulding Gauge stream flow was less than this 14,400 acre feet per year. It was less than that for 200 days, or 55% of the days in 2017. So we've got enough with that development. We will kill the river. It doesn't happen immediately, and that's one of the problems. And we hear people say, including in the past, at least one city council member who says, I grew up here, that river hasn't changed at all. And I won't tell you who. No, not you. Not at all. So to continue with the Paulding stream gauge, so measured stream flow of more than 14,400 acre feet per year, enough to provide those homes at 5 homes per acre foot. In 2017, there was only a stream flow adequate for that for 165 days. The lowest stream flow at the Paulding Gauge in 27 was 13,000 acre feet per year. Yesterday's stream flow at 16 CFS is about 11,600 acre feet per year. So the implication, and I'd say it's a very, very strong implication, is that eventual depletion and ultimate loss. The implication is eventual depletion and ultimate loss of perennial stream flow in the Verde River above Perkinsville, and that'll cause about a 1/3 reduction in base flow at the Clarkdale gauge. And I'm sure the people in the Verde Valley who have exactly the same problems, but they're not going to be happy about that. Okay, we don't have really the ability quite yet to put this into a really solid time frame, but there are a couple of studies that have been done that give us sort of a handle. The USGS did a fairly recently a report, and they calculated the effect on base flow if pumping in 2005, if it were just locked in the same places and the same rate that it was in 2005, and then if it were extended a century, No new pumping, just hold it all the same. The decrease in base flow at the Paulden gauge by the year 2110 comes out to about a 23% decrease. And one of the things that happens when they try to hold the pumping steady is, of course, that wells go dry. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them. And in this particular study, they just let them go dry. They didn't try moving the well somewhere else. And Pete Krupnick, who's a hydrologist with CWAG, made an estimate that he decided to model pumping from the Big Chino Water Ranch at a rate of 12,000 acre-feet per year. I think the rationale was that there is another source of water that comes to close to 4,000 acre-feet per year that would be available to be, it would represent retired irrigation and would be available to pump to Prescott. So it's 8,000 plus 4,000 that Pete used for modeling. And he determined that amount of pumping would cause a reduction in base flow of 3,300 acre-feet per year in 90 years. So the sum of those is about, it's about 48% reduction in base flow in a century. Now, that doesn't say anything about new development or any such thing, but it gives you sort of a time scale. We're not talking about something that's going to be a problem in the next few years, and it's not going to catch a lot of attention. It may, combined with drought, catch a lot of attention, but you know, we'll look at it, we'll be gone, and if you would go to the Paulden stream gauge this year and go 10 years, you'd say, well, it looks about the same, but the numbers don't quite tell that story. Okay, so here's a summary of some numbers. Prescott's Big Chino Water Ranch is approximately where this blue rectangle is, just to put it in context. And Prescott has hopes of importing 8,000 acre-feet of groundwater from the Big Chino Water Ranch into Prescott every year at some time in the future. They have the legal right to import at least 8,000 acre-feet per year. That's 11 CFS of pumped groundwater from the Big Chino Water Ranch. We face a hypothetical ultimate build-out in the Big Chino Valley of homes that could consume as much as 14,400 acre-feet per year. So I'm adding numbers here. So I've got 14,400 from that, 8,000 from the Big Chino Water Ranch, and then I added lost reduction of underflow from the Little Chino subbasin. That's the groundwater from the Little Chino subbasin that still reaches the Verde for about 1,500. That comes to nearly 24,000 acre-feet per year, and that's 33 CFS, and we're at 16 this morning. So we have a problem, folks. So we need a new way of thinking, and we can't wait. And I'm just going to read these. I'm sorry to do that, but solving overcommitment of Big Chino groundwater must be a priority issue for PRAMA communities and citizens, but it is also a regional issue involving communities and citizens in the Verde Valley and Maricopa County. Meaningful implementation on a regional basis will require new political thinking with understanding and commitment by citizens, business, and elected officials. Some change in state law will be required, and it won't be easy. I can guarantee that. The time to start is now. The longer we wait to address the issue regionally and forcefully, the greater the damage and the greater the cost. Delay will make protecting the year-round flow of the Verde River more difficult, and inaction will doom it. So I've listed some ideas about potential strategies to augment or reduce the demand on our groundwater. One that CWAG is hard at work on is drought-tolerant landscaping. And another one that we're working on, at least in part, is residential and commercial area rainwater harvesting for landscape irrigation, non-potable indoor use or groundwater recharge, increased reuse or recharge of treated wastewater, controlling groundwater exploitation by land use management. That's really difficult. Here in the AMA, we've got some, in the active management area, there really are some controls that are based on water availability. They're not as effective as they need to be, but there really are some controls within the active management area. Development is not unhindered by any means. But outside of the active management area, it is essentially unhindered. Water is not a consideration except to the buyer, the developer maybe. But the county supervisors are really hamstrung in their ability to manage water. They are hamstrung by state law, and they are hamstrung by a law that was passed called Proposition 207 that says if you, county supervisors, take an action that ends up in reduction of the value of somebody's land, they can sue you for that. Well, golly, I was going to turn this land into Big Chino Town, and I was going to have millions of dollars, and now you've taken that away from me, and they can't do it. And they don't have the management tools, and it's a problem. We need to change law. We need to modify the law. We need to find a way to make it possible for well-intentioned supervisors, councilmen, whoever, to do what needs to be done without running afoul of the law. One possibility, and I was really intrigued by learning about Gene and learning about the conservation easement in the Agua Fria drainage, because one possibility would be a completely legal way that wouldn't require change in law, would be the purchase of development agreements, paying a rancher to give up development rights, keep his land, continue ranching, have a place for his family, and that's worked in other places, and it's exactly the kind of thing that the Gene's Central Arizona Land Trust is doing. I think it's something we need to think about, but again, it's not easy, and it probably takes a tremendous amount of money. Another one is stormwater management that supports aquifer recharge. We're limited by law on what we could do with stormwater management. We can't capture runoff in a gully, in a tributary to the Verde Valley, and send it to a infiltration basin or an injection well to return it, because you cannot interfere. It's against the law to interfere with what's called appropriated water, and appropriated water is any water that's in any kind of a natural channel. A gully is a natural channel. You can't touch it. I think probably the biggest objection to diverting that kind of water and sending it to a place where there are infiltration wells, let's say, is the Salt River Project. And I think that if we really could conceive of a well-thought-out plan and we knew how to fund it and so on, I don't think that, it's my opinion, solely opinion, that a well-done project would work to SRP's benefit. Their concern is the water commitment that they have in Maricopa County. And it's, the Verde is a big part of that water. They've got the right to that water, and it's a real right. But I think if this were well thought out and were done maybe in collaboration with the Salt River Project, they could be convinced, you know, this is going to solve your problem because it's going to keep that keep those groundwater levels up and keep the river flowing. Their right is to surface water from the Verde. Anyway, I think that's the kind of thing that would require change in law. It would require collaboration that goes way beyond anything we can do right now. And finally, and the most drastic thing is regulation of groundwater pumping. We have regulation of groundwater pumping in Prescott Valley and in these incorporated communities. It doesn't regulate people with individual wells. Question?
Can you turn the microphone?
I'm sorry.
Like in the direction.
How's that?
Positive. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have to learn to do this. Anyway, groundwater management would really be viewed, more groundwater management would really be viewed as onerous, but it may be one way to not only protect the future of the city of Prescott, but the Verde River as well. And so I guess the question is, will we preserve this desert treasure for future generations? And this was a statement I found that I really liked. This came from Lester Snow, who was several years ago was the director of the California Department of Water Resources. And he said, quote, "There is a tipping point somewhere," I added in past which, "you can't catch up, and if you don't make decisions now, you may have made a decision you can't recover from." And I think that really applies. And with that, I'm open for questions. So if you have a question, just come up here. We want to get it recorded, so we'd like you to come to the microphone.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's very good.
You're welcome.
My question is, what is going to be the effect of the Big Chino hydroelectric plant that is being proposed upstream in the Big Chino, which will really reduce the water flow in the Big Chino and the Verde River? Has anybody really calculated that part of it?
Well, there's certainly a lot of thought in it, and I think I can say that CWAG will not support anything that costs Verde River flow, cost loss of Verde River flow.
Very good. Now, my question is, this is controlled by federal government. How does CWAG get involved with the federal government?
Well, it's not just a matter of the federal, I'm sort of at the limits of my legal ease here. I don't think the federal government is free to say, sure, come on in and help yourselves. There's a lot, that's private land that they're talking about. The federal government would have to be able to do what you'd say. They would have to come in and take over that land. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the people, if you take what they say, and they seem like nice people, take what they say, they're willing to really address the problem of protecting the river. I think that for the sort of annual amount, which they estimated about 1,200 acre feet per year, that could be mitigated, let's say by retirement of irrigation. You could mitigate that effect. The one that I think is more problematic is their initial fill, which I think was, it was 28,000 acre feet. And of course, we don't have any control of that. All we can say is, you know, if you come up with something that doesn't impact the river, we'll go along with it as from our water concern standpoint, but unless you can show, then we'll oppose you. Now, we're not the law. We're just a group of citizens.
Thank you. Yes, we're not the law. We're a group of citizens that can voice an opinion. But again,
That's
the
right.
person with the deepest straw wins. And as your one slide presented shows, as the water is drawn out from a well that's way down low, water flow will change direction and go
Oh, yeah.
towards that well,
Yeah.
which will reduce the flow to the Verde River. That is a huge concern for homeowners and for the city of Prescott and Prescott Valley.
Well, it's our concern too. Gary, microphone.
Yeah, let me, good question, thanks. Let me supplement that answer. You know, both the Sierra Club and CWAG have been meeting with the folks from ITC concerning this proposed pump storage facility. They've been pretty receptive. One thing we have stressed big time is that you can't harm this river. Now, the pump storage project is regulated and permitted by the FERC, F-E-R-C, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. As such, this project has a federal nexus. FERC requires them to do a full environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement requires an analysis of environmental impacts that extend off-site. Consequential damages, effects have to be evaluated. That would include the Upper Verde River down to Perkinsville. They have to evaluate several alternatives. They can pick any alternative they wish, so they can pick the worst alternative. The National Environmental Policy Act doesn't require any particular decision, but it requires the analysis. We have plenty of time to do public comment on that. I want to point out, too, that there are, in the Verde watershed, there are 15 species listed by the Endangered Species Act, and these are only the riparian and riparian obligate species. There's 6 additional upland species in the watershed for a total of 21 species in the Verde watershed that are protected by the Endangered Species Act. If you take water out of the Verde River and you diminish the habitat for those species, that's a federal issue, and you can't do that. That's a taking. So we do have some input on this. They've been receptive, and the next couple years, we'll see what happens.
Anybody else? Well, thank you all for listening.